The old coastal town of Windermere had always been shrouded in a thick veil of mystery. Its narrow cobblestone streets, lined with ancient oak trees and dimly lit lanterns, seemed to hold secrets within their shadows. For those who lived there, life moved at a slow and predictable pace, except for the occasional story passed around about the haunted lighthouse that was situated on the edge of the cliffs. In the heart of this town lived a woman named Emily Thornton. Emily, who was in her early 40s, was a history teacher by profession, and she had returned to Windermere after spending years in the city. She had inherited her grandmother's house, which was a charming, ivy-covered cottage that overlooked the sea. For Emily, the cottage was more than just a home. It was a place filled with memories of her childhood, where her grandmother would tell her the stories of the town's past, about the sailors who were lost at sea, and how the lighthouse on the cliff had once guided them to safety. Emily's life in Windermere was quiet, almost too quiet. She spent her days teaching at the local school and her evenings reading by the fireplace or taking long walks along the beach. Despite the peaceful surroundings, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from her life. She felt a need for a sense of purpose and a connection to something greater. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, Emily decided to visit the lighthouse. It was something she had avoided doing for years, partly out of fear and partly out of respect for the town's superstitions. But that night, something drew her to it. She felt a strange compulsion that she couldn't explain. She grabbed a flashlight and set out along the winding path that led to the cliffs. The wind was cold and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks filled the air. As Emily approached the lighthouse, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The tall structure of the lighthouse loomed before her, its stone walls weathered by time, and its iron gate creaking in the wind. The door to the lighthouse was slightly open, as if the lighthouse was inviting her inside. With a deep breath, Emily pushed it open and stepped into the darkness. The interior was exactly as she had imagined it would be. It was dusty, abandoned, and filled with the scent of salt and decay. The wooden staircase spiraled upward, disappearing into the shadows above. As Emily climbed the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The lighthouse was silent, except for the sound of her footsteps echoing off the walls. But there was a presence in the air. She felt as if something or someone was watching her. When she reached the top, Emily found herself in the lantern room. The large glass windows in the room offered a panoramic view of the sea, and she could see the faint glow of the town's lights in the distance. But it wasn't the view that caught her attention. It was the small wooden table in the center of the room. On the table lay an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Emily's heart raced as she approached it, her hands trembling slightly as she picked it up. The cover was unmarked, but when she opened it, she saw that it was filled with handwritten entries. These were diary-like notes that documented the life of the lighthouse keeper. The entries began with simple descriptions of the weather, the maintenance of the lighthouse, and the ships that passed by. But as Emily read further, the tone of the journal changed. The keeper wrote of strange occurrences. He mentioned lights appearing in the distance on stormy nights, whispers carried on the wind, and a feeling that he was being watched. One entry, which was dated just days before the storm that took his life, has sent chills down Emily's spine. It read, "The light appeared again tonight, far out at sea, but it was no ship's light. This was different and unnatural. I fear that something is out there, something that wishes to come ashore. I cannot explain it, but I know that I must keep the light burning. I am the only one who can." The last entry was unfinished, the words trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. It said, "The storm is upon us. I can hear the wind howling, the waves crashing against the rocks. The light. It's getting closer." Emily closed the journal, her heart pounding. The stories her grandmother had told her suddenly seemed more than just tales. There was something real and dangerous about the lighthouse and the keeper's fate. She wanted to know more and understand what had happened that night. The next morning, Emily visited the town's small library, hoping to find records or accounts that might shed light on the lighthouse keeper's life. She spent hours poring over old newspapers, town records, and maritime logs, but found just a little more than what she already knew. She learned that the keeper had been a man named Samuel Driscoll, a widower who had taken the job after the death of his wife. He had no children, no family to speak of, and had lived a solitary life in the lighthouse until the storm claimed him. As she was about to leave, the librarian, who was an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, had approached her. "I couldn't help but notice you're interested in the lighthouse. Not many people around here are," Mrs. Hawthorne said. Emily nodded, feeling a little embarrassed. "Yes, I've been reading about the old lighthouse keeper. I found his journal last night," she said. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes widened slightly. "You went to the lighthouse?" "I did," Emily admitted. "I know it sounds strange, but I feel like there's more to the story. Something about that place, it doesn't feel right." The librarian glanced around the empty library before leaning in closer and said, "There are things in this town that we don't talk about, things that have been forgotten, or rather, things we've chosen to forget. But if you're determined to know more, you might want to speak to Mr. Garrett. He's the oldest living resident of Windermere who lived here all his life. If anyone knows the truth about the lighthouse, it's him. But be warned, he doesn't like to talk about it." Emily thanked Mrs. Hawthorne and left the library with a new sense of purpose. She found Mr. Garrett's house easily enough. It was a small, weathered cottage near the edge of town. The man who answered the door was as old as the house itself, his face lined with age and his eyes sharp and piercing. "What do you want?" Mr. Garrett asked. "Mr. Garrett, I'm Emily Thornton. I recently moved back to town, and I've been learning about the lighthouse. I found the journal of the last keeper, Samuel Driscoll. I was hoping you could tell me more about what happened to him." Mr. Garrett's expression darkened. "There's nothing to tell. The man died in a storm. That's all there is to it." "I don't think that's all. Please, I just want to understand," Emily pressed gently. For a long moment, Mr. Garrett said nothing. He seemed to be weighing his options, deciding whether or not to trust her. Finally, he stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. The interior of the cottage was simple and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and well kept. Mr. Garrett motioned for Emily to sit, then settled into an old armchair across from her. "Samuel Driscoll was a good man," Mr. Garrett began, his voice steady but filled with deep weariness. "He didn't deserve what happened to him." "What did happen to him?" Emily asked. Mr. Garrett sighed. "There's a lot you don't know about Windermere, Miss Thornton, a lot that people here choose to forget. But if you're asking about the lighthouse, well, there's a reason no one's touched it since that night." He paused as if collecting his thoughts. "The light Samuel saw out at sea, it wasn't from any ship. It was from something else, something that shouldn't be here. The old stories, the ones your grandmother might have told you, they weren't just tales. There's something in the water, something ancient and powerful. And for some reason, it was drawn to Samuel." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean that whatever it was, it needed Samuel to come ashore. That's why he had to keep the light burning, to keep it away. But that night the storm was too strong. The light went out and Samuel, well, he tried to relight it, but he never had the chance." A heavy silence filled the room as Mr. Garrett's words sank in. Emily felt a mixture of fear and disbelief. Could it really be true? Could there be something out there in the ocean? Something that had been responsible for Samuel Driscoll's death? "What happened after that?" Emily asked quietly. "After Samuel died, the town closed off the lighthouse. They said it was too dangerous, that no one should go near it. But the truth is, they were afraid. They didn't want to know what else might come if someone tried to light that lantern again." "Do you believe it's still out there? Whatever it was?" Mr. Garrett's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Emily saw a flicker of fear in them. "I don't know, but I do know this. Samuel wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. That's why people stay away from the lighthouse." Emily left Mr. Garrett's cottage with more questions than answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more she needed to do, something that went beyond just understanding what had happened. The lighthouse had been abandoned for too long, its purpose forgotten, and its light extinguished. But what if that light was the key to keeping the town safe? What if by relighting the lantern, she could finally put an end to the mystery that had haunted Windermere for decades? That night, Emily returned to the lighthouse. The wind was stronger than before, and the waves crashed against the cliffs with a ferocity that mirrored her own turbulent emotions. She made her way up the stairs to the lantern room, the journal clutched tightly in her hand. When she reached the top, she hesitated. The lantern was still there, untouched, its glass covered in dust. Emily took a deep breath and opened the journal to the last entry, the one Samuel had begun to write before the storm took him. The words seemed to echo in her mind as she read them, as if Samuel himself were urging her to continue what he had started. With trembling hands, Emily reached for the lantern. It was heavy, its iron frame cold to the touch. She wiped away the dust and set it on the table, then struck a match and held it to the wick. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the flame caught, flickering weakly at first, then growing stronger until it filled the room with a warm, golden light. Emily stepped back, her heart pounding. The light cast long shadows across the walls, illuminating the room in a way that felt almost otherworldly. She walked to the window and looked out at the sea, expecting to see nothing but darkness. But she was wrong. Far out in the distance, just beyond the horizon, a light appeared. It was faint at first, a small, flickering dot against the blackness of the ocean. But as Emily watched, it grew brighter and closer until it was unmistakable. It was the same light Samuel had seen, the one he had written about in his journal. The light that wasn't from any ship, but from something else, something ancient and powerful. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the light drew nearer. She could feel the air around her grow colder, the wind howling outside the windows with a force that rattled the glass. The lantern's light seemed to waver, as if struggling to stay lit against the encroaching darkness. For a moment, Emily considered running, leaving the lighthouse and never looking back. But then she thought of Samuel Driscoll, the sacrifices he had made, and the town that had lived in fear for so long. She couldn't let that fear control her. She couldn't let it win. With renewed determination, Emily walked back to the lantern and adjusted the flame, making it burn brighter and stronger. The light filled the room once more, driving back the shadows and pushing away the cold. As she stood there, gazing out at the sea, something strange happened. The light in the distance began to change. It was no longer a single eerie glow, but several small, scattered lights moving together. Emily realized these weren't supernatural lights. They were lanterns. The outlines of boats became visible, small fishing vessels that had been caught in the rough weather. The fishermen had likely been out at sea when the storm hit, and now they were making their way back to shore, guided by the lighthouse's beam. Suddenly it all made sense. The old tales of the mysterious light out at sea were never about ghosts or spirits, but about the lighthouse's true purpose, guiding those in need back to safety. Over the years, as the lighthouse had fallen into disrepair, the town had forgotten its importance. The fishermen who ventured too far or were caught in storms would have been lost without that guiding light. As the boats drew closer, Emily could see the relief on the fishermen's faces, their expressions illuminated by the warm glow of the lighthouse. She knew now that her decision to relight the lantern had made all the difference. The light had saved lives that night, just as it had so many years ago. When the boats finally docked at the harbor, Emily watched from the cliff as the fishermen disembarked, some looking up at the lighthouse with gratitude, others simply glad to be home. Among them, Emily noticed an older man who seemed familiar. He was Mr. Cooper, one of the town's elders, someone who had lived in Windermere his entire life. The next day, Mr. Cooper came to visit Emily at the lighthouse. He climbed the steps slowly but with purpose, and when he reached the top, he found Emily waiting for him. "I saw the light last night," Mr. Cooper said, his voice filled with emotion. "I haven't seen it shine like that since I was a boy. You saved those men, Emily." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth in her heart. "I just did what needed to be done. The lighthouse was built to guide people home, and that's what it will keep doing." Mr. Cooper nodded, his eyes misting with tears. "You know, Samuel Driscoll would be proud. He dedicated his life to this place, and you've honored his memory by bringing it back to life. The town will never forget what you've done." As word spread through Windermere, the people of the town began to rally around the lighthouse. They organized efforts to restore it, repairing the weathered stone walls, polishing the lantern glass, and making sure the light would continue to shine for generations to come. Emily found herself surrounded by a community that cared deeply for the town's history and its future. The loneliness she had felt for so long began to fade as she became an integral part of Windermere's renewed spirit. In time, the lighthouse became more than just a beacon for ships. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always light to guide them home. The stories of ghosts and hauntings were replaced by tales of bravery, resilience, and the power of community. Each evening, as Emily lit the lantern, she did so with the knowledge that she was continuing a legacy, the one that had been started by Samuel Driscoll and now carried forward by the people of Windermere. And every night as she looked out at the calm sea, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had found her place, her purpose, and her home. The lighthouse stood tall on the cliffs, its light shining brightly in the night, like a beacon of hope and safety for all who saw it. As the years went by, the town of Windermere thrived, its people bound together by the light that had guided them through the storm and into a brighter, more connected future. Reflecting on that night, Emily understood that true purpose lies in being a guiding light for others. In restoring the flame, she not only saved lives but also discovered that in helping others find their way, she had found her own path to belonging and fulfillment.